Today's lecture is on the broad subject of organic evolution, but with the special perspective of a geologist where we look at transformation over huge timescales. And of course, we look at organisms like this iguanodon here that no longer exist and who have descendants, the birds, that are so different from them that you really can't use the modern animal kingdom to say much about anything of the ancient. Although we did that last week with the dinosaur eggs. So even though we are using a different perspective, we do have to talk about evolution from a biological perspective for a couple of things. The first of which is taxonomy. And we owe this creation to Carl Linnaeus, who created this classification scheme for all living but also fossil organisms. And it is a crude measure of evolutionary relatedness. So you've probably heard that we are Homo sapiens. Well, that is the genus and species, genus Homo, species sapiens. Or you've heard the dinosaur name, Tyrannosaurus rex. Well, Tyrannosaurus is the genus, Rex is the species, and it's all part of this hierarchical system that he developed. And I always say it as Kathy poured coffee on Fred's good suit: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and is very useful and still is used today. And you can categorize any living organism with it. And doing so gives you a crude measure of evolutionary relatedness. So look at this here. These columns are different animals. And then on the extreme left side here, you see the taxonomic hierarchy. And so kingdom, there are only 5 of them, and you only know the 2 big ones really, Animalia and Plantae, animals and plants. And if you look at this, if you go down, wherever you have each of these columns share the same perspective, that shows their level of relatedness. So all of these are animals, but these 3 are chordates. And then if you go down with these 2 on the extreme right, they're mammals, they're carnivores, they're canids, those are dogs. And then one, Canis lupus, that's the wolf, and the other, Canis familiaris, well, that's your regular dog. Notice that wolves and dogs share all of these down to the very last level, species, where they are indeed different. Tyrannosaurus rex is listed over here. Notice it's an animal, it's a chordate, but it's not a mammal, it's a reptile, and then these other things, and then there's the genus species name I told you. The one animal over here, it's also an animal, but after that, notice it is different at every single level. That's because this is a little snail. All right, so that's taxonomy, and that came about in the middle of the 1700s. We'll flash forward about 100 years, and we have these 2 gentlemen, Alfred Russel Wallace on the left, Charles Darwin on the right, and together, independently, they both come up with the theory of organic evolution by natural selection, which is shown here. And I won't read off all these things to you. It's just simply that over time, populations will start to reflect the characteristics that are more successful in an environment. And by more successful, I mean having more offspring that have these characteristics. And because we have geologic time, you can do this. Even the smallest little change, if it becomes directional, can make huge changes. Now look at this picture here. These are Wallace-Darwin giraffes, but you could also imagine them as long-necked sauropods, dinosaurs. And so on the left side you have the past, the geological past, and you have some original group, a population, and you've got long-necked ones, medium-necked ones, and shorties. And then if there is some advantage to having a longer neck, for instance, you might be able to get more food up here in the higher vegetation. And that probably was the case for sauropods, just like it is for these giraffes. Then those long-necked giraffes are going to be more successful. They're going to get more food, they're going to be healthier, they're going to have more offspring, they're going to live longer. And over time, as this is done over and over and over and over again for, again, thousands to hundreds of thousands to even millions of years, in the future you're still going to have a population with variation, but the average neck length is going to be significantly larger. And if this fact continues and continues and continues into the future, well, you're going to get the creation or the origination of new species. Well, what is a species? So you are looking at a modern avian dinosaur, the mockingbird, state bird of Texas, and it's a nice example of the biological species concept. It has an array of populations, so you need to have groups of these organisms. And then the next point is key. They are actually or potentially interbreeding, such that they can breed with each other. Mockingbirds can breed with other mockingbirds, but they can't breed with, say, cardinals or sparrows or warblers or anything like that. This is a very useful definition, but what can it possibly say about fossils where we can't really see interbreeding or reproductive isolation? What about asexual organisms, organisms that just clone themselves? So there is another species concept, which is more useful for fossils, like this ammonite you see here. And this one is just based upon morphology. And morphology is just description of the form, the shape, the size, the density, etc., everything that describes the form. This is all we have to do with fossils. And sadly, for the biologists, here's an angry one right here, or an exasperated one right here, they end up using this too. So very few of them go to the effort, the hard work of documenting biological isolation and interbreeding, reproduction, and most species are described based upon their morphology. Okay, so described species. What about making new species? This is called speciation. And one way we could do it, I just talked to you about natural selection. If that operates long enough, then eventually, at some point in the future, those populations will diverge to the point where they could not possibly interbreed. Meaning if you took a male from 10 million years of the past and introduced him to a female 10 million years to his future, and they would be so different, even though they are from one successive population after another, they'd be so different that they could no longer interbreed. The sperm cells from the male would no longer fertilize the egg cells of the female. Once that isolation has occurred, this interbreeding, then you could say that a new species has been created, or there's origination. Some people view this as a pseudo-speciation because where do you draw the line? Is it a sharp line, a fuzzy line? In this diagram here, you have evolution in the y-axis and time. Let's say that these are in little 1 million year increments from 0 to 10 over here. And you've got a species that is slowly changing over time. Let's say it is a sauropod neck tripling in length over time, such that you now can, if you just go by straight morphology, name species 1, species 2, species 3, but you'll have fuzzy boundaries between all of these. And then if that's the origination of species 2, well, is that the pseudo-extinction of species 1? Makes it a little complex. But there is another way that we think speciation typically occurs, and this is what we call allopatric speciation. And geologists are probably the major sort of proponents of this because it invokes a geographic barrier, geology, created by plate tectonics. Now in this diagram, you've got time going vertically, and again, just picture this as the whole thing is a 10 million year segment of time. And these little colored polygons that are sort of going up the middle, these are the boundaries, literally the geographic boundaries of all the populations of a particular species. And at some point, notice this thing in the middle says geographic barrier, you start the creation of a geographic barrier. Now, it could be a giant mountain range produced by plate tectonics. It could be the start of a small but ultimately giant ocean basin. Something that creates a geographic barrier such that species A gets progressively divided, and then at some point when it is successfully divided both morphologically for the morphological species concept, and also in a reproductive sense for the biological species concept, we say that species A is gone, and we have now species B and species C separated by this geographic barrier. Plate tectonics creating the barrier that ultimately leads to the speciation. It doesn't always have to be where one species goes extinct. You could have this situation as well, where species A exists in this polygon, but you've got little isolated peripheral populations of this. Maybe these are little isolated populations in a separate valley or a separate small region. There's not a lot of interbreeding or interaction between the isolated small population and the major population, and a geographic barrier occurs, or a crisis, a random event, something happens, and the small isolated population begins to diverge to become a new species. Meanwhile, species A continues going on as it did before. Another example of this, and this is sort of beetles. These are little flightless beetles, and they've got a range of colors. And I chose this just because it shows barriers don't always have to be giant mega barriers like mountain ranges or ocean basins. Plate tectonics can also create new climatic zones, new areas of drainage. And here we've created a large river system such that it's large enough that these small little flightless beetles, they can just crawl on the ground, don't get a chance to cross it. So interbreeding stops, and in the southern half, the lower half, there's natural selection for darker, browner, beige-colored, earth tone type colors for their environment. But in the upper area, there's selection for more greenish colors to blend in with that vegetation. And even if that barrier is removed at some point in the future, if isolation has gone on long enough and the interbreeding has been cut off long enough, then we could say that two new species have been created here. A couple of examples from the real world, and most recently, say the past 13 million years, maybe less than that, certainly last 3 million years, excuse me. The Isthmus of Panama, the little spit of land that connects North America to the upper left with South America to the lower right, prior to the creation of this Isthmus of Panama, because of plate tectonics, the water between the Atlantic and Pacific was free and open, and creatures were free and open to interbreed there. 3.5 million years of separation have led to speciation of this small crustacean organism here, such that on the Pacific side, the males have a very, very large left claw. On the Atlantic side, the males have a very, very large right claw. And this is enough to affect behavior, courtship, reproduction, and ultimately, well, speciation. Same thing here with these pork fish. The Isthmus of Panama arising out of the ocean, separating these two ocean basins almost 4 million years ago. These pork fish were one species before that, and now they are two separate species. So think of this process of happening, and think about the world of the dinosaurs. The next few slides are all slides of the world during different time slices, and notice what's going to happen with the land masses. So first, this is the late Permian world. This is the world before the dinosaurs. before the Mesozoic, and you have this single continent Pangaea. It's almost pole to pole. Flash to the early Triassic. This is just before the origination of dinosaurs, and you still have Pangaea, but we're starting to see the unzippering or the separation of the continents. The Jurassic, and boom, here you really see it. This is the Hispanic corridor, and it separates North America from South America and Africa. Notice as well that Europe and Asia start separating from North America. And then in the Cretaceous, you have the separation of South America and Africa, Europe and Asia from Africa as well. North America is separated. India is separate. Australia and Antarctica are still connected, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But go back again. Continents together, separated, separated, separated. I hope you see the relationship between this large-scale plate tectonic structuring and our allopatric speciation model that we talked about earlier. You get the evolution of different dinosaur faunas on these different land masses as they separate over the long period of the dinosaur. All right. Well, now let's look at a unique story or tale of dinosaur evolution. And this is going to take us, let's step back here. So look at the Cretaceous. This is the late Cretaceous. And look at the bottom part of this map. Here's Antarctica and Australia, still barely connected together. And Australia is way down here in the realm of this Antarctic Circle, we would call it. So this map here shows Australia today moving, inching closer and closer to the equator. But here it is in the early Cretaceous, barely separated from Antarctica, and so far south it's within this Antarctic Circle. Now, the Cretaceous was certainly a much warmer geologic time period than today, but this far south, it's like going to the South Pole. It's still going to be colder. It's still going to be much, much darker for huge times of the year. And so dinosaurs that would be found here would have evolved to deal or adapt with this environment. Well, what do we find there? When we go there, the rocks tell us that this is indeed a river environment. We've talked about those before. The bone beds are mostly transported bones. We've talked about that before. But there are a few articulated ones as well. So we're using some of our earlier concepts to talk about what we have there. And what dinosaurs do we have here? Well, first of all, here's an interesting one. Allosaurus. This thing was thought to go extinct in the Jurassic, and it's mostly from the northern part of the globe, so in North America. Also, those North American ones were big, 5 meters height at least. Here, they're much smaller, only 2 meters in height. Here's a unique hadrosaur, Muttaburrasaurus. This is one of the duck-billed dinosaurs. And again, it's much, much smaller than other hadrosaurs elsewhere in the world. Tamimus, it's a theropod, a Saurischian dinosaur, a predatory dinosaur. It is also dwarfed. This thing would have, at its tallest, reached your knee. I hope you're getting the picture here that we have an unusual set of dinosaurs that are all micromorphed or dwarfed. They're small. It continues. They haven't named it yet, but there's an ankylosaur, and this thing is about the size of a sheep. Also ceratopsians this side. Very, very small. In addition to the dinosaurs, there's one of the very first placental mammals there. So there's mammals there a few centimeters long. But the most common dinosaur there is this Laelinassaura, which is called a hypsilophodont. We'll talk about those later. And I like this picture here because you see an average male for scale and the size of these things. This is also a primitive ornithopod, so it's distantly related to those duck-billed dinosaurs, but still one of them. And they have hundreds of these things here. Now, recall the high latitude location. So this is way up here, and it's or way down here, close towards the South Pole. This should follow Bergmann's rule, and Bergmann's rule says that the body mass, the size of living animals, increases as you go towards the poles. If you go to colder and colder climates. This even holds for today. This is a human example of today, and where you go to from warm climates, African individuals, to colder and colder and colder climates in Europe, Mongoloid, etc., there is this increase in size. Here's an example for deer. This holds for animals on land, in the water, in the oceans. In general, things get bigger the closer you go to a pole. So here's a little teeny Nicaraguan deer. Here's a big buck in Michigan. Why don't the dinosaurs do this? Well, they should. Bergmann's rule says that this happens because animals will maximize their volume while minimizing their surface area. This is a way to retain heat. So by getting bigger, you are going to be able to retain more heat. They should be bigger there. But there is another factor at play here. There's something called the island rule. And in the island rule, if you're a large species on a mainland, a continental landmass, and you somehow get isolated on an island or some region that is, again, think of allopatry here, isolated enough where evolution, natural selection is going to take them in a different direction, the direction is usually towards diminishing size to be able to accommodate life in an area where resources are reduced. There is the opposite case as well, where small things will be increased in size on these islands, but usually the island rule is thought of in this miniaturization thing. So this South Australian fauna is probably a case of the island rule, either an island or an isolated peninsula where this dwarfing occurred in this resource-limited environment. Just a little hint of what's to come here. Let's look again at this Slielinosaura. How did this thing deal with the cold? How did it deal with the lengths of the night? Well, we'll talk about the cold later and whether this thing could somehow regulate its body temperature. But what about life in the darkness, the length of the night, 24-hour night times that would happen as the planet tilted away from the sun for that season? And these hypsilophodonts have huge eye orbits, much larger than they have in higher or lower latitude areas. So perhaps the hypothesis became that perhaps this was for enhanced vision in the dark. We see this with a lot of creatures today. There's a little bit more evidence for this. Remember, I said there's so many specimens of this. We have a lot of casts of their brains in which they have enlarged, larger optic lobes. So the hole in the skull that holds the brain reflects the different sort of relative sizes of the optic lobe, the olfactory lobe, etc. And the optic lobe is where the processing of visual information occurs, and it's enlarged for this beast. So it probably did have some enhanced night vision that allowed it to forage in this winter darkness. But what about the freezing or sub-freezing temperatures? I'm going to leave that for a future lecture. Another great story of dinosaur evolution.